So, picking up the discussion, the earlier discussion, in which it was asserted or explained that the ultimate goal of liberation, that form of the highest good, is meant in the sense of terminating the continuum of the contaminated heaps, or the grasping heaps. And that represents liberation, moksha, or Tharpa in Tibetan. There's a further distinction. So the more widely used term, or the more, let's say, the spiritual term for liberation is nirvana. And so there are two nirvanas: the nirvana with remainder and nirvana without remainder. And the main interpretation of those two terms is that an individual who reaches the point where he or she has destroyed, achieved the cessation of all the mental fictions, we can describe that person as having achieved liberation. However, that person, if they're still living, they still have then skandhas which have not been terminated. And especially the physical skandhas are skandhas that were produced by karmic causes, or samsara causes. So then there is that distinction. So even though the general definition of liberation is to have brought to a termination the continuum of the heaps, then that can be understood in more specifically to refer to the nirvana without remainder, which means that when an arhat comes to the end of his or her life, then that the continuum of his or her contaminated heaps is in fact brought to termination. Then, nevertheless, we would still maintain that while long before that, after which they have destroyed the mental fictions that are still living, we would not deny that that person has attained liberation.
길을 치게 다윗이 길을 뒤지게 인연이 구구야 말이 그에서 기억이 구구티 기분 장가세요 봐 마시면 그 타버터 돼 타버터에 인연이 구구티 돼 봐. 이 시스템인데 인연이 구구티 이미 세면 봐. 그래서
가서 톱산에 있는 분들이 남네 사이트에 기차디 수고 직벌을 왜 민기 부모들做양 사이트에 왜
이 부분들을 가지고
가운데做的 사이트에 수
아직 부분들이 있는 남이 이게 시를 찾으면 원시두수 사실은 남격진 알바 남국은 두개란 말이에요. 원시두수 자격이 있었지. 남국은 성령 시를 지금 3대가 남대는 무슨 살까?
So, addressing that distinction between the Arahat who's still alive versus the Arahat who comes to an end of the life in which he or she has attained liberation. So, in that lifetime when liberation is attained, then there is a time prior to the attainment of liberation in which his or her 5 skandhas are produced by contaminated karma. So that lifetime was initiated by samsaric causes, even though it may have eliminated a significant portion of the mental affliction or not. There are many different permutations about how Arhat status is achieved within in a particular lifetime. However, then once the person achieves liberation, so then the so-called then the synonym for mental afflictions is this term outflows or asravas, which is the real term that's associated with contaminated or impure. So the asravas have been eliminated, but there's still a part of his or her skandhas which we would say is associated with the asravas, for example. So how would we identify that? So the physical body of that person, it remains the same physical body that he or she had prior to attaining liberation. So that body remains contaminated or related to the asura until that individual dies, even after they achieve liberation. And among the rest of their skandhas, then the mental skandhas in particular, only those elements of his or her mind that are associated with the truth of the path. The truth of the path being the form of the skandhas that represents uncontaminated skandhas, right? That wisdom and the truth of the path itself, which the person now has as an arahat, is an uncontaminated or an element of the skandhas that are free of the asura. But not every part of his or her mental makeup is the truth of the path. That person still is subject to sensory cognition, sensory perception. And the sensory perception has nothing to do with the path. So if you had to identify it, you might want to, perhaps you would call that not an uncontaminated part of the skandhas, or perhaps even further, you could say it is contaminated. So there's that way to understand that the person's skandhas that were produced by samsaric causes, making them contaminated or related to the mental fiction, that continuum has not been terminated. So not until that person's life ends, then when his or her life ends, then because they don't have any mental fictions any longer, then there's no more samsaric rebirth. So then that becomes the person's liberation becomes the form of nirvana, which is out remaining. And there are various ways to think of, well, what happens to the person at that time, that arahat, once they've passed away. So the position that is generally accepted as the correct position is that the mind continuum does not undergo extinction. The mind continues, but it's no longer a contaminated mind. So that what happens to that arahat is that he or she will undergo a form of birth, the 4 different kinds of births that one can take. And they will take a birth which is, in Tibetan it's called Gyumed, which often is translated as miraculous birth. But it really means something more like something that occurs spontaneously, that there is no gestation period, and once the next life is taken, it is taken immediately in a fully formed manner. That's what that form of birth more specifically means. And that form of spontaneous birth could likely take birth, for instance, in a Buddha field. Takes person's Buddha field, and a Buddha field is identified as a realm that is separate from samsara. So then that person would remain in that state of quiescence, still existing, still a living being, as an arahat, being reborn in perhaps some Buddha field. So this morning, the main topic that we were discussing was the proofs or the arguments for establishing the existence of the highest good, right? So the highest good are the ultimate goals. Ultimate goals being the liberation of jnana path or the ultimate enlightenment of the Buddha. Both of those. We discussed that, what the proofs were. Then there's another topic, which is proofs for the existence of the temporary goal, which is the term for which is literally an elevated state. Abhyudaya in Sanskrit, Unto in Tibet, Toa literally means elevated, a higher position. Right? That higher position meaning a favorable rebirth. So in the root text, after the discussion that relates to the highest good, there's a very brief statement about that is applied or is understood as referring to the goal of this temporary goal. And so in the text, the terminology that's used to differentiate them is that the highest good is the principal goal, the principal topic that's addressed in the treatise. And then the second goal of higher, more favorable rebirth is a pelba means an ordinary topic, a less important topic. And so, I was quoted the lines. I'm not sure which verse they are, but there's saying that I believe what he read was that having established the truthfulness or validity of the highest good, then one can infer the lesser goal of the higher good. And there's a little beyond that. And so it's saying that suggesting that the proof of the ultimate goal is an illustrative of, can be used as an illustration for establishing the claim that there is such a thing as temporary goal, the goal of a favorable rebirth. Then more in the commentaries, how this is further explained is that the temporary goal cannot be proven on the basis of the type of inference that was mentioned earlier. To say that the ultimate goals can be established on the basis of inference that at the foundation rely upon ordinary experience, or direct experience. I forget the name of the Sanskrit for it, but it means inferences that draw upon experience that's observable. And then in Buddhism, among the two kinds of correct cognition, inference also has two types. One is this type of inference we just mentioned, which is what we normally think of as an inference. And then the second kind of inference is one that relies upon scriptural authority. The reason it's called an inference is because the reason that's given is to establish the existence of that temporary goal is that it is asserted in the scriptures, and then the typical or the classic quote is actually not a scripture, but from Nagarjuna's Ratnavali, which says something to the effect that Gyumed long to Gyumed long to means Gyumed means generosity. Generosity is a cause, karmically, to bring about the result of abundance of possession, prosperity. So prosperity comes from generosity. Chim ki de, and then chim means morality. Shila. Chim ki means on the basis of morality comes, and then the word literally is happiness. But happiness means that the well-being of a favorable rebirth as a human being or a worldly god, for instance. So those two statements of the causes for those two qualities, while they're taken from Nagarjuna's treatise, ultimately they're sources from the Buddha's sayings himself. So that's it's so is it said in the scriptures. However, it's not, the scriptures are described as a valid basis for drawing an inference because, and then the scriptures are described as Jeva Sungi Dape Lung. And that's a very important phrase that refers to an analysis of that followers are meant to cultivate in order to be able to be confident in the scriptures as being trustworthy. So there's three kinds of analysis. And those three, if we can engage in those three kinds of analysis based on the three kinds of epistemic objects that are associated with the scriptures, and to say that it literally says literally means to be pure. What it means is that the Buddhist scriptures are known to be correct or known to be unerring. Dapa pure here means free of error, based on this threefold analysis. And when we determine that the Buddha's body of sayings as a whole, which includes these three kinds of objects, there's nothing that we can discover about them that, using the three forms of analysis, that we can determine to be erroneous. Therefore, whatever the Buddha may say about things that are beyond our comprehension, such as the nature of karma and the workings of karma, especially in its more subtle forms, we can rely on. And so then I'm saying, therefore, because the Buddha taught the causes that will bring about a higher realm rebirth, and they come from the flawless canonical scriptures, then we can use that as a valid argument, a valid inference to establish the existence of that goal, the temporary goal of saying how there is such a thing as a higher realm rebirth, because it is established on the basis of scriptural authority, which is free of any error, as determined by the three kinds of analysis.
예수님의 모든 소화는 내내 여와는 농취가 세야지 다 고주 신부 고주리 다지에서는 그 지당 모두 세야지 미디에 모두 보관 내디에 농소리 이제 사라지 살나 군주 다른 무슨 소리 미디에 무슨 소리 어디에서는 문도 이나 신부들이 미국이란 말이지. 이 예전에다 먼저 고관지 신부들이 예서야 돼. 어차피 예수는 이제 돌아내 돌아는 문제가지. 딱 그래서 이말에서 이렇게 토야네. 그나마 지금 되지. 물론 이제 땅 지금 서가인데 지금 이게 때문에 같이 네 알았어요. 세배 알았어요. 지금 이 논두세 농지 가서 집에 농지 침지 때 세배 제신 아니 세리얼 바지 두레를 세배 제신 세배지
세배가래
저기 지스
지 넣었어
또주부터 말이 손대지 상대기 상대기 누구가 시비죠 시 너희 별로서 실은 또기 도와를 도와주기 스크란도 자기 부지를 이하에 이해사니까 네 문제 고관 그랬으니 그냥 농촌 문제를 뒤집어 달라는 당원을 뒤집어 해서 이 문제의 수준수만을 뒤집어 저는 그런 문제에 대해 서가를 때리 준비해요. 서가들이 제가지 세대체 아니 라나 지 그런 문제에 대해 세대도 먼저 잡으지나 이 안주비도 그런 문제에 말이 그 아니 거기 대화를 제 준비하라 이내야 제때 아니 먼저 잡으이나 네 가보시면 문주 주고가 그래서 아니 여러 뒤에나 거기야에 준비해요 아니 제가 뒤에 제가 어쨌든 다른 농 집에 농촌에서 팀지 대에서 그 먼저 때 순서를 제가 농촌 그런 뭔가 터셔야지 년순에 터야 내주도 순 지당 년들이 아니 루트스다 농주야리
그래
루트스는
아니
루트야라 이내서 그거가 이제 다 농주 되게 안 나. 농주 세야지 농주 그간 전에 진발했지 농주야지가 농주 세야가 어디에서 농주 또 그랬죠.
그래서
북한에서는 그 마마마마지 이제지 수빈수 진바탕 서가군 이제를 때니 이제 중날이 시작하고 어디 시행도 정말 이 신부님이 다시 단계기 또 이제 부모님께 집에 진바탕에 집하네 아니 지금 굉장히 시원하게 가사 굉장히 지금 굉장히 시원하게 저가 굉장히 좋은가 있어. 이날 때니 아니 그냥 숨숨 토에 토를 내니 이 토를 뭉치다 숨을 이스 다 상이 무슨 거 들이 지키고요. 대산다 제수의 답을 뭉치지 이번 집에는 지금 뒤시고 뭉치지 그 상이 숨들과 제가 숨이 나가 있어. 제가 숨이 나가 눈이 되지. 눈프란 뜻이요. 아니 어디에서다 알려주지.
Então, muito bom, Churchill, Yore, Carlesana, Jubel, onde tive será que Lum, que eu sou mitad Lum, Juque, Yore, assim,
não tem Candiate Miluaris, Candiate Miluari, Candiate Jefferson Guitar. Jefferson Guitar, some Miluas. Jefferson Guitar. 성민이 차를 숨으면 인생 불경증의 차나 이라도 제가 변명하면 시의 불경증의 차나 향을 있지다 아니 렌팅을 지다 그 의식을 더합니다 얘네 때문에 두고요 이렇게 제가 있어요.
So this is now a discussion about the nature of this temporary goal of achieving a higher status. So the term monto literally means some kind of elevated, higher position. So literally, its literal meaning is that it is a form of existence which is higher than the lower realms. And it is a form of existence in which forms of happiness are able to be enjoyed. That's kind of the word explanation of the term, literal explanation of the term. Similar terms are terms that are equivalent. There's a distinction between Ngendro and Dendro. Dendro means literally a happy migratory state. Sukha, which means a form of migratory existence, which is a form of well-being, a state of well-being, or a state in which well-being is enjoyed. So that term is equivalent to the term, the more technical term of an elevated state. So the higher migratory state, or the more or the happy migratory state, refers essentially to human beings and worldly gods. Samsaric gods. So so the Buddha explained or taught also the means of gaining that temporary goal. Essentially, and three principal causes are generosity, which brings the higher state quality of prosperity; morality, which brings the higher state quality of the form of existence, literally the body, but that form of rebirth. And then thirdly, patience brings the higher realms quality of having an extensive or a good retinue, it means a good circle of associates, companions, and so on. And so these three elements together are sort of the central attributes of the elevated state or the higher realm state. The thing of the kind of the philosophically significant point about this topic is that it is described as being a subject which is, to use a literal translation of the epistemological term, extremely hidden object. Shintoboku. Extremely hidden means it's something that is not seen, literally an unseen thing, versus a seen thing. A seen thing is something that we have direct experience of. And then among those things that we don't have direct experience of, there are things that are accessible to us through reasoning. Those are slightly hidden things. And then the third category is things that are extremely hidden, meaning they're beyond ordinary comprehension, beyond the ability of an ordinary person to determine with certainty for himself or herself. So it's saying the temporary goal of a higher realm rebirth falls into that third category. So then one kind of question might arise. Well, what's hidden about human beings' form of existence? Human beings' life is an exemplar of this higher status. Human beings can see one another, so how hidden is it, right? And even human beings have the ability to achieve levels of one-pointed concentration in which they can become directly evident of, directly aware of worldly gods. But maybe ordinary human beings can't see worldly gods, but human beings do have the capacity to perceive worldly gods, and certainly among the realm of a particular realm of worldly gods, all the worldly gods that are in that realm, they see one another. So what's hidden? Why do we say that this is a hidden subject? So that needs to be answered. That question, but that is philosophically needs to be understood in the philosophical sense of why it's hidden. So, first thing is to identify those three types of epistemic objects, which we already mentioned, right? Kawan means the things that are seen are the things that are evident to us directly, right? Then things which are slightly hidden are subjects such as selflessness and impermanence, those subject matter that was covered in the doctrine of the Four Noble Truths. Those things are not evident to us directly, but if we use the proper form of inferential reasoning, we can in fact determine their truthfulness. So they're only slightly hidden, so they are accessible to us. But then there's this third category of entities which are extremely hidden, meaning only a Buddha, not even arahats, not even very advanced bodhisattvas, can fully comprehend a certain type of subject matter. And typically that refers to the workings of karma, subtle workings of karma. So then the basis for the argument that proves the existence of this temporary goal is that the Buddha's teaching is made up of those three types of entities. He's taught the five skandhas, that's evident things that we can observe and verify ourselves. He taught the Four Noble Truths and how to comprehend them. And we can investigate those, and using our own inferential reasoning, we can determine there is no argument or no proof that we can adduce which can show that what the Buddha taught about that second category of object is false or flawed or erroneous in some way. So then that is the second kind of determination that what the Buddha had to say about that category of object is error-free. Right? So we can also examine what he said about evident things, teaching of the five skandhas. We can determine, yes, everything that he says about objects of ordinary experience, we can verify. So then that is something that we can recognize. There's nothing from our direct experience which is at odds with what the Buddha said about directly evident objects. That's his first two categories. Then the third category of those extremely hidden objects, as we said, is by definition are things that we cannot directly verify or indirectly verify. But what we can do is we can examine in the whole the whatever instructions, whatever doctrine the Buddha taught about that subject of extremely hidden objects, mainly what are the karmic causes that are responsible for a particular individual, one of his own followers, for instance. Sometimes he would reveal. So the word is same word is used as to prophecy, but what it really means is to reveal. He would reveal to his disciples. So this disciple who had this very unusual thing occur in his or her life is due to something that occurred at some vast time in the past, which even people who have some sort of awareness cannot identify. And so there are many different instances like that, and if we examine them, we cannot find anything that is said in different places in the scriptures that are contradictory or in any way at odds with that. So whatever he said about karma is consistent in every respect. There's another statement we said before. He never said things like bathing would purify. There's another example that is given. He didn't say anything about karma that was kind of counter that the obstacles are mental in nature. So there are things like that. So these are all parts of hidden objects. So then that third and that form of analysis, if we carry it out to its full extent, and we can determine that we can't identify anything that kind of nullifies what the Buddha may have said. Here he said this, and here he said the two are kind of contradictory. Can't find any such. So those are the three kinds of analysis that, taken as a whole, then give us a justification. It would be prudent for us not to abide by what he said about the nature of karma. He said bad karma will cause you to be born in hell, but we can't determine it's true. We would do well, nevertheless, given who the Buddha is, what the Buddha taught. We ought to trust that. So it rises to that level of knowledge or confidence. So that's why this particular topic of the temporary goals, which are relating to statements such as generosity is the karmic cause that will bring prosperity, morality is the karmic cause that will bring a favorable form of rebirth, and patience will bring then a good revenue. And it also, and Rinpoche spent a little bit of time talking about patience in particular. And he said that there are two qualities of patience that are identified. One is that we are more likely to have more of a circle of friends, if you like, if we are patient. But that would be one consequence in this life of having been patient in the past life. Because what does that mean? It means that we are more tolerant, we are less likely to be quick to anger, and if we're a person who's angry, the antithesis of patience, that's a very much of an off-putting quality or trait, and so we're likely to have less friends if we are a cantankerous person. I can't think of a better word. An angry person. So that was one aspect of it, and the other one is that patience is identified as a karmic cause for physical beauty, for physical attractiveness, and maybe also, there's two kinds of beauty: the physical beauty and the inner beauty. So, I don't know. Anyway, physical is one that's usually identified. So, and the notion is, there's something said recently in the news that's very controversial, but the idea is that physical beauty is also something that people are drawn to. So in that sense, patience will also, contribute to your getting along with people easily and well. That in keeping with that, Rinpoche has said that an angry person can have a wide following, but typically it would be something that he or she is able to command by some sort of authority or by some sort of influence, not naturally, right? So that's one distinction about how patience promotes that kind of ability to draw a circle of friends. He mentioned also that the other remaining three paramitas also are said to have some karmic sort of consequence or result that's associated with it. So I mentioned in the case of effort, Sundru, Virya, that it produces a quality which is a kind of almost like a luster, kind of majesty, a kind of what's the word? Dignity, or not dignity is not the right word. Something almost physical, some kind of brilliance almost that emanates from it as a result of kind of majesty, that you exude as a result of having been someone who cultivated effort. In the case of one kind of concentration, it has the ability to quiet the mental things, quiet them in the sense of make them less active. It doesn't destroy them, but it reduces their alertness. And then in the case of wisdom, the main aspect of wisdom is that it can promote liberation. So we mentioned those points as well. So the main consideration, or the main sort of philosophical kind of issue about this temporary goal is that it is designated as being something that represents epistemologically an extremely hidden object, something that we cannot verify for ourselves, but that we can believe in on the basis of that type of inference that's based on having investigated the Buddha's teaching as a whole. I think I covered most of the points.
I wanted to talk to Nasuna. 예전에 여사 토하는 여러 농수업 같은 분들이 이런 지금 무슨한데 의미도 그만 수업을 우리가 모두 그리고 그야 내를 상계를 같이 지금 수업을 때는 의미도 수업을 했지 상계를 수업을 이 그대로 제니 다 상계를 수업을 문제제 negri siapa sudah di Canada, ani tinggal menuju tim di sini menuju tim. Angkat saja dengan milu ini, Jampa Sungi Tabra Nui Vich, Nui Vita Shap. Nothing the Jimatan Latini, Noju the Sultan Latini, Siati, Sanjay, Jibel Muju Kim the Sierra the Little Jenny. That was the killing the remission. Jibatan John and Jibatan is the Patan Toyam. So this is one of the movement to prevent the kick. The Patan the young lady who seemed to sit. That correct and in this dog basing. That's I give you some tea. Jibatan seemed to be the San Jay. This Jefferson Tavel, the is a issue that are doing the legal that the digital can go into carrying to that even to get the Sanjay, they wanted to have a galen in reality, wanted to not Chabadi, the record to now. That the Panacea, Sanjay, the Gale, Milua use. Gale, Havana Milua use. He paid that Sangeti Chibatan in Mati Sangi the Milua is he never Sangeti Milena Milua as he is unknown to the Milua in the 50 half. So the Milua is a the Tabatan Milua in the is the Chabati Yamanti. So the Milua in so Tabani Milua in the Milua. What is each of them Canada into Anichi Bataya, Children's Children, Chimano Julia, Chibataya, Chimano to command to do Suya, that was I gave you the penny, and each day, each year, share the Batanity. Young or the is that the gentleman that will take children to issue treaties. It's the younger than lawyer. No matter the Jefferson Jefferson
So, still on the same topic, and maybe to sort of present something that should be the basis for understanding this topic, then the formal argument can be expressed as follows. The scriptural statements, such as those which assert that generosity brings prosperity and morality brings the well-being of favorable rebirth, is the subject of the thesis. Consider those scriptural statements. Means they, the predicate is they are non-deceptive or unerring or correct as relates to their import, the meaning that they express, the meaning that they indicate. They are unerring in what they say about their subject matter. And so saying they're true because they are a form of scriptural statement which is free of any error as determined by the three kinds of analysis. So that's the formal argument. to understand. Then the point that's being made is that we can, that's meant to be taken as a proof of the existence of the temporary goal. And the nature of the temporary goal, meaning that what are the qualities, what are the causes, what are the spiritual qualities that we need to carry out or cultivate in order to achieve that temporary goal, then we don't have the capacity to verify using our own ordinary reasoning powers to verify that such a relationship between those causes and those results is in fact true. Not in the same way that we can recognize, or we can investigate, or we can reflect on what the Buddha taught about Four Noble Truths and how they are a valid doctrine to prove the existence of liberation, for example. So, in that sense, they are an extremely hidden object. The only way that we can verify that assertion about the possibility of attaining that goal is by relying on that form of analysis, threefold analysis of the Buddha's teaching as a whole. So that implies that we have to know how to engage in that threefold analysis and engage in that threefold analysis. If we do so, then that should be a justification or a way of verifying that we can trust what the Buddha said about that extremely hidden object. I'm trying to think now. So, just to mention again those three elements of the higher realm state of the temporary goal again. Three causes for the element of prosperity and the element of the rebirth being due to practicing morality and having a good relationship with some circle of associates. That those are things that we can rely on only because the Buddha taught that there is that karmic relationship, cause and effect relationship between those causes and those results. That's not something that we can determine through our own ordinary reason. I don't know if what else I think about that. I don't think that.
Yeah, that is true.
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, yeah. So, as one element of the formal logic, especially in Indian tradition, is that typically, not necessarily following sort of the established rules of the logic schools, even outside of Buddhism, is one of the elements of a complete logical statement is that it includes a concordant example that is illustrative and is supportive of the argument. So you make the argument has a relationship with this predicate of the thesis, and then you give it an example of which the predicate and the reason are also true. So the illustrative example, or the concordant example that's given for this particular proof of the temporary goal of Buddhism is, for example, the just as, so the concordant example is just as one can establish the ultimate goal of the highest good, liberation, on the basis of the traditional inference. I don't know what other word, I can't remember the word for that. Logokirika, right? Logokirika means regular inference, I would say. So regular inference can prove the inference based on the explanations the Buddha gave, how to prove the nature of the highest good, and then that is put forth as the principal goal of the Buddhist teaching. Principal goal of the Buddhist teaching, principal aim of the Buddhist teaching is to achieve the ultimate goal. And this goal is a more ordinary goal. Peva is more, a lesser goal. So the validity of the Buddha's teachings that enable us to infer the existence of the highest good serves as a concordant example that supports this other type of argument that's based on inference that relies on valid scripture about its. So the concordant example is that the principal goal is a more important goal, and so it carries some weight towards supporting the argument in favor of the lesser good.
That the Manduki, Tandegi, and Mandu Prabhanti, me, you gave the chicken someone to shake the back. This new method we should give it. And it shouldn't taste as well as in chicken lamb smart. So, it all internet chicken is things that we use at it. There is also container, so you can get to do the territory, so you pass it, so you the answer the so you pass it to the counter. You get the counter. So, chicken the one chicken not dog. Chicken not dog in it. The chicken the you did it too. Chicken the chicken the counter. Chicken in it. So you can't get it, chicken city. So you did it, chicken city. So you got it, chicken. Answer correct, so you answer correct means so you can't get chicken school. This and my one. This chicken the 3 days school. That is chicken mama doing this one. So the that's the sooner to break it up, and then chicken the days, 3 days soon. Somebody is. As I did somebody is. Should you yeah, that is Sanjay. Sanjay is one of the janitor. Many Suki Swara telling to come to place. Challenge EGGRD. Sanjay will tend to play with you. Imagine Virginia, Luna Martin Virginia, the third shooting Sunda the shooting the Gyumed and shooting the Sunda the Khensur in the James. Shooting pass at it. Oh, that in the James should be shooting. She should go with China. I think there is a new man having it shooting the not to go back to 3 days and shooting 10 days. I told you in the soldier pass, but you pass a answer to get in the soldier pass. Today, she Majin Balimba family, Majin Balimba family, to get it. She shoot you back. He married that. 상계 기준에 따라가는 지지에 문제된다. 먼저 기준이 되네. 시행이 얼마나 있어야 상계 기준. 기준이 되는 기준이 되어야 봐.
Particularly statement.
오늘 기준이 내시에 돼야지. 상계 기준도 이시자 지지에 봐.
Much of it. Much of it.
아니.
So, this is, as you listen to this, you may be following it, but there are certain sort of implications of what this is saying that we should, that if we think about it more fully, will kind of expand our perspective and our kind of way of approaching our Buddhist practice, for instance. So, what we're saying is a way to describe this particular topic. So we are experiencing our current lives as the life of a human being. And according to the Buddha's then assertion, the main reason that we are enjoying this human life is that at some time in the past, in a previous life, some previous life, who knows which previous life, we engaged in some form of morality. Okay? But that's what the Buddha taught about the path, the conditions that bring about this temporary goal of Buddhism. So, if that's true, then if it were possible for us to verify that, so we say, oh, the Buddha taught that. So let's see if that's true. So let's see. In order for us to be able to verify it on our own, we have to be able to determine by what? By reasoning. So we can infer sort of in an indefinite way. We can infer that what the Buddha said is at some particular time, it's a very specific time, at some particular place, physical location, our mind continuum, in previous life, engaged in an act where we rejected immoral conduct. That's what morality, the fundamental element of morality is the avoidance of misconduct. And there had to be a particular, typically, this morality is something that is carried out in relation to other living beings. It's conduct that we execute or we carry out in relation to another specific living being in some way or another. So the typical example would be the moral act of refusing to commit taking the act of murder, taking the life of another living being. So there has to be, if that happens to have been the specific karma that produced our current human life, then if we were to verify it on our own, we would have to have some means of determining what was the specific act, at what time, in what place, as what sort of being, ourselves as the agent, and in relation to what other sentient being did we carry out the act. And so then there's another kind of interesting term. The word for morality in Tibetan is sul chim. Sul chim literally means sort of appropriate rules, almost. It means rules of behavior. Right? The Sanskrit for it is shila. The Sanskrit word for shila doesn't necessarily mean morality. Shila is a neutral word, and that can refer to any conduct. It can be shila. And then it has a specialized meaning of morality. Then there is another prefix that you can put on shila, duk shila. Duk shila means wrongful behavior. And the Tibetan equivalent of that is Sutrim Chelo, or just Tul Chelo. And so Chel is wrongful. So wrongful behavior in Tibetan is Tul Chel. So Tul Chel would be the potential act of killing another sentient being, which we didn't do, and which we avoided as a form of morality, which is virtuous conduct. Right? So just terminologically, that also is relevant. But the point is, there's no way to determine that. We have no way of determining the specific instance of morality that determined that we were reborn in this life as humans. No way. And so it's in that sense that it's an extremely hidden object. And the only way that we can understand that that's the case is by relying on the Buddha's doctrine about karma, and specifically the individual principles that he set forth. For example, the 10 non-virtuous karmic paths, the corresponding 10 virtuous karmic paths, and how they were explained and described as leading to these kinds of karmic results. So if we rely on that, we can infer in a general way, not in a precise way, that we currently enjoy human life because we must have engaged in something like this in the past. Why? The only way that we can answer that question is because we can rely on that the fact that the Buddha's doctrine is supported as being a system that withstands 3 kinds of analysis. And when we engage in that analysis, then we can generate a sense of confidence, strong confidence, not knowledge in the normal sense of knowledge, but knowledge in the sense of prudency demands that we accept those pronouncements which the Buddha gave. And that's what the form of faith that's called belief is. It's belief at that level, not just blind belief, but it's justified belief about the doctrine of karma, based on the fact that we have determined ourselves that the Buddha's sayings are trustworthy. So all of this is relevant epistemologically to the subject of this temporary goal and how we can infer or believe that certain kinds of behavior, certain kinds of moral conduct, related virtues will ensure that we can achieve that goal.
미가스네.
이 때문에
말이 상계기 템베트리.
맞아 상 때문에
상계기 템베트를 우리 템베트 이해가. 상계기 템베트를 가르치 않으면 하드 비기비 유니스를 찍으라. 상계기 템베트를 주스리. 또 냠네. 냠수나야 또 찍으라.
로또 기타가
아니 가루
So that wraps up the discussion of proving the temporary goal of attaining higher status, or discussion of the elements of that subject. So next topic is attaining a realization that the teaching, Buddha's teaching, is flawed. To attain a realization, some knowledge, gain an awareness that the Buddha's teaching as a whole is flawed. So that phenomenon, or that topic, requires that we start by defining what do we mean when we say Buddha's teaching. Demba. Demba means Buddha's teaching. Shasana. Then the formal definition of the teaching is any person who is a seeker of liberation, right? Then that entity, which is the uses a word which means something like a point of entry. Gyumed. Gyumed is like point of embarkation. You're going to go on and you're going to travel on a boat. The place at which you get onto the boat is like the Gyumed. So if you're seeking liberation, there's something that you must apply yourself to as certainly the starting point, and then rely on if you want to reach that desired goal. You're a seeker of liberation, so that's your aim. So for such a person, that subject, that object rather, that you apply yourself to as a mental object, right? Mikvah means a mental object, and which has two forms to it, either a scriptural aspect or a cognitional aspect. Scriptural aspect means the words that by which the teaching is communicated. Cognitional aspect is the knowledge that you can generate by embodying or integrating or practicing that scriptural teaching and attaining an awareness of its meaning in your mind. So both of those are aspects of the teaching. So there's a scriptural form of the teaching, and there's a form of the teaching that represents the attainment of various levels of the path.
that is scientific tendency. Long tendency is scientific solution. That topic tendency is scientific solution. 저희 양손하고 때리 아니 중대이 되지. 그래서 안배이 토배이 이
맞다 또 봐요.
인생이 관계이 되지. 그래서 양손하고 때리 아니 지기 이게 인제지다.
그렇게
그래서 방법이 인제지다. 또 방법이 인제지다.
So these two aspects of the teaching Then lung means the scriptural teaching, agama, in the sense that it is the words of the doctrine itself, the verbal aspect of the Buddha's teaching, by which it's communicated. The cognitional, the adhigama can mean knowledge, or it can mean attainment, it can mean realization, it can mean a number of things. So I will propose the idea of cognitional teaching. So the cognitional form of the teaching means then some quality, good quality. Gyumed means spiritual, is perhaps spiritual quality, some form of spiritual attribute which is achieved, achieved means mentally attained through practicing the meaning of what the scriptural teaching asserts. So it's something that has to be put into practice, and if it's put into practice, and then you gain some spiritual quality within your own being, then that spiritual quality that you possess in your own mind represents the cognitional aspect of the Buddha's teaching. And that has two forms to it. So those spiritual qualities can either be qualities that represent the abandonment of obstacles or flaws, and it can also represent spiritual qualities that represent forms of knowledge or positive qualities of realization that one can develop. So there are qualities of abandonment and qualities of realization, both of which are forms of the cognitional aspect of the Buddhist teaching.
That topic can be Sanji Sun Yangsunanda Tennis, Jampa Tung, Jampa Ninji, Sanju Sim Yamne. That to me to Isu Kangalutan, Tobe Temba. In it over Latin Panja, Sara Pishi, Servatus, and Tobe Temba, that's Pango. Temba Nicherina, Pangata to the state and Sanji Sun, Tubache, Latini, Jampa to Kisha, the Yerba. She does the Jampa to the Campuria. Angulo the Yarba, you take Angulo on the Jampa to I get it in the Mashuka Casa to the Jampa to It's Sanjay. Ani Jerendi Namsun number in Sanjay Theoria. Niji Jambati Janjus. Niji Bataya. That's what you see that Andrea. That is a very Sida Janjus in the Janjus in the Okay, embarrassing. Which is true to say, young me trade is at the trade. Jampa and Egypt and to sing the new to us. Then, Jimba Pamanasu. Chicken Sundara to Kanga. Ranjami, true, coming with what it is. Ramiti young Nana. Sanjay tension. To be Sanjay school and I see daily. Indeed, any children have a solution in national people. Sanjay case daily. Children Nasuna, Nasuna Kayam. But in a certain person, Chokudos in a body. Sanjay Obey embassy at the Chokudos at the Chokudu in other. I guess we did that should be the money. Creatures and that. Topet can be seen in this Angigi. Should be should be better sometime never be. Yanti Hagan sometime never be. Hagan. Underage sometime Amari. The guys in the children. Angi Yamne Tisha. Yamne Tia, Diane Buddha. Yamne Timena, Sangi, people, Sangi Gaviati, Sangi Man, Shete, Yamne, Nira Jabia. But he is under Tobet Embassy at the Chukudos and Chukudi. Tobet Embassy at the
So this is a very important distinction between the two types of teaching, of the two forms of the Buddha's teaching. So the scriptural form is not difficult to understand. The cognitional form, cognition is probably not the best word for it, but I'm just trying to use a term that indicates that it's something that is generated in one's mind, cognitional in that sense. So the point was made that the spiritual qualities, either forms of abandonment or forms of realization, those kinds of spiritual qualities that are gained, obtained, achieved on the basis of practicing the scriptural teaching, putting into practice the scriptural teaching. So how do we do that? So we do that on the basis of the first, most basic form is to hear the teaching, listen to the teaching, learn something about what the teaching is telling us, and as we listen to it, we can gain some kind of understanding, get some kind of knowledge. So even that level of understanding can rise to the level of cognitional form. Then a more active form of that aspect is to reflect on what we've learned and kind of refine our understanding, make our understanding more certain, more definite, more than something that is through our own powers of reflection, we can gain some certain understanding, unerring understanding, clear understanding of it. And then further, we can develop other qualities of one-pointed concentration and so on. Then all of those positive qualities, mental qualities, gained in that manner represent elements of the cognitional aspect of Buddhist teaching. So then, further to that, we say, well, the virtuous qualities such as loving kindness and compassion, and so on. We mentioned earlier that every sentient being that has ever existed has, at one time or another, been a parent, and in their capacity as a parent, they have, had a sort of natural tendency to feel concern and love and caring for their own offspring. So that kind of, and those attitudes, we would say, represent some form, some quality of loving kindness, compassion. But we would not want to say that those represent cognitional forms. So even though they are qualitatively related to spiritual qualities that are gained through spiritual practice, we don't include them within that strict definition. So what is the kind of minimal condition for something to be a form of cognitional teaching? So then the determining quality is that we are engaging in the act of refuge. So if we carry out the act of taking refuge in the three ratnas, then we have entered the teaching. And then whatever spiritual qualities that we gain on the basis of the scriptural teaching. So if we go beyond whatever natural qualities or potential we have for developing spiritual qualities, and we take some teaching that ultimately comes from the Buddha about how to cultivate loving kindness and compassion. And then we try to develop it. We understand it, and then we try to engender it in our own minds. And if we do engender it in our own minds, then it becomes a form of the cognition. And so we can develop all kinds of qualities, such as bodhicitta in that way. We can develop an awareness of emptiness in that way. And that awareness, obviously, is a form of knowledge or understanding. So that's a form of cognition. Then beyond that, we mentioned there was the qualities of abandonment. So the qualities of abandonment are more, what should I say, more restricted, more specific to having attained the transcendent path. They refer to the truth of cessation. We don't attain the truth of cessation until we achieve the path of seeing. But there are all kinds of spiritual qualities that we can develop through practicing that rise to the level of the cognitional teaching before we achieve the path of seeing. Certainly when we achieve the path of seeing, then those are also the cognitional. So when we reach that level of, say, the path of seeing, then we have generated the truth of the path. Then we have also generated some form of, we've acquired some form of the truth of cessation. Those are the two defining attributes of the Dharma Ratna. So once we attain those forms of the cognitional teaching, then we have attained the true refuge that the Dharma Ratna provides.
Then that check comes to this check to go see the check in nature.
Correct.
And Niji Chimbo Kona, surely just goes here. But just to get a teaching, like canvas together. Niji Kundu Sambako into the Rawaji, Cherry. The Wati Karichavi, Kangan to Elchi. Niji Kun, Savakon, Chigera. Yes, and then Niji Chimbo Kunji naturally kept to play his yard. The Niji Chimbo Kunji, surely just cheese at it. Now do not say just cheese. Get it. Get on the together.
Love, right?
Just cheese.
Don't
let it get
Correct.
That's Niji Chimbo Kun, surely the Rawaji Cherry. Okay. Honey, clothes.
Correct.
The ready to tell you, we are the watch we are teaching. Then, you teaching Kuna, so just be a so just go see it. Yamnet, no string, Yamnet, yet. Teaching just be a pushing. Yamnet and check just to done everything. Oh, these and children. Nico, my name is Nick. Tamian may be sure, but he is saying to be. As I'm giving to be Tempani, us, over Tempasiati, Chukusiati. And we should run easy at the Kundo. The Kundo, Pasanji, Kundo. Yes, I'm giving Tempasiati. Jamdi received a Joa Kangolo, Nesanji with Tempari. Yeah, Jamdi really given it. And it is a big old country.
And you can copy that.
toge tenga tati
Okay.
macho kunjo sia te text toa tati te toa le ji cho kunjo te ba chedan cho kunjo te lende ta tamgo ta lende ti cho kunjo te es nia sone ke mi cho kunjo te o tamgo ta lende te o di ti chung di yamle ji me ti chena nia sone ke ti ya ba ti ke mi cho ti chung ni yamle ti tamgo ta lende ti o di is na ti chung na sa ti ni nechi ni sunde tani mundi parchi viati tanto tenere su ti o ti tachi
So we're kind of equating the word teaching with the word dharma. And so when we say dharma, we talk about dharma with a capital D, meaning the teaching, the spiritual dharma. We should understand that to mean especially the cognitional form of the dharma. There is a scriptural form of that dharma which verbally gives expression to spiritual practice. But the important thing is to understand how we should use the spiritual dharma as the basis for ourselves to gain some internal spiritual qualities that represent the true sense of the dharma in terms of, say, the dharma that we take refuge in as something that has the ability to give us protection or to liberate us, save us from some unwanted untoward consequence in the future. Typically, another point that Rinpoche made, which going back to from something you said earlier, typically we think of temple, we think of scripture books, we think of images, we think of these things as things that are of spiritual value. Those things are inanimate objects that in and of themselves cannot do anything directly to save us. Sitting in a temple in and of itself does not guarantee that we're going to escape being reborn in the lower realms. Then the dharma, the act of refuge is carried out in relation to the three dratnas, but among the three, and the most important one for us directly is the Dharma Ratna, in the sense that that is the actual refuge, that is the actual entity that provides refuge. So the Buddhas cannot willy-nilly save us by just wishing for us to be saved. They teach us the means by which we can save ourselves, and only when we take that teaching and internalize it, practice it, will we gain the ability to achieve true refuge. So, also the act of refuge, when we take refuge in the three ratnas, that act itself is identified as an act of placing your trust and placing your hopes in the three objects that we recognize as necessary for us to achieve our spiritual goals. So we have to rely on them. We cannot do it on our own. But simply to recite the words of taking refuge and then sit back and do nothing is not likely to bring us very much. That taking refuge is not simply the act of reciting the formulas of taking refuge and, in fact, correctly placing your trust in them. It also implies that you will follow through on that act and adopt and accept the instruction, learn the instruction, and put it into practice. So the act of carrying out some kind of spiritual activity under the influence of the act of taking refuge in the three dharmas, that is the true meaning of the cognitional dharma. And moreover, those efforts, those activities, those forms of spiritual training that we engage in to cultivate spiritual qualities like compassion and loving kindness and bodhicitta and wisdom and so on, we can think that those in effect, those are also instances of taking refuge, going for refuge. So we're going for refuge in the sense that we are bringing about the actualization of what will endow us with the knowledge that will, in fact, protect us and keep us safe from, for example, having to be reborn in the lower realms. So in that sense, engaging in the act of taking refuge and abiding by the principles of karma, avoiding non-virtuous deeds, and cultivating virtuous ones as a form of morality, basic morality, that can be actually a form of the Dharma Ratna, of the Dharma jewel. And for a person, the practitioners of lesser capacity, that is the Dharma Ratna. That is what protects. That is what gives refuge to that type of practitioner, in that it guarantees that he or she will not fall into the lower realms. So when we think of the Dharma Ratna in the stricter sense of either the truth of cessation or the truth of the path, any one of those two elements, that's a form of the Dharma Ratna that is, at this point, truly the more ideal form of the Dharma Ratna, but for us, it's probably a little bit, for the present, beyond our grasp. But the more basic form of taking refuge and practicing the morality of avoiding the 10 non-virtuous deeds, that is the real form of Dharma, in the sense that it can directly and immediately give us some refuge. And we should think of that. So that is the form of the Dharma in the sense of the cognitional Dharma or cognitional teaching that we need to resort to as an act of refuge, as the act that will provide refuge. And so it is the true form of another way to think of the act of taking refuge, besides simply mentally entrusting yourself to the three ratnas. It is kind of the necessary consequence of that. If you truly entrust yourself in the three ratnas, then that should imply that you are ready and willing to engage in those activities that will ensure that we benefit from the potential of the Dharma to give us some genuine refuge.
다들이
So we're almost out of time. This is what we've been talking about most recently. We should understand under the subject of what is the Buddha's teaching. How do we understand the Buddha's teaching? It's scriptural form and it's cognitional form. And the general goal is to be able to recognize that it is flawed, to determine for ourselves that the teaching is flawed, both in its scriptural form and in its cognitional form. So having given this introduction to that topic, a few remaining minutes, and then questions. Invite questions. Okay. I'm sorry.
There was a couple of questions about karma. This is going back a little bit, so I apologize. But one of them is sort of a couple of related things. One of them was that Rinpoche said that the way that you look is based on like the way that your parents look. It's not really necessarily an expression of karma somehow.
I'm sorry, what?
Isn't there something where he said that the way that you look is not necessarily defined by karma, like the way that your physical body looks? It's based more on something that you take from each of your parents.
This morning, that was something.
No, that was like 2 days ago or 1 day ago.
Right. I'll say that, but it's escaping me.
Because my question is specifically on that point was that are there other aspects of our lives that are somehow influenced by some factor other than karma? That's one of my questions. And then
other aspects of our lives. Do you have anything?
Well, just like your physical form. I mean, I know that there's aspects of like you can be more beautiful if you do this, X, Y, and Z. But as I recall, at least when you translated, he said something to the effect of like the way that your parents look shapes how you look, and that's not necessarily based on karma.
Oh, I think I vaguely think I know it. Something about some aspect of our being is a karmic wrapping, some aspect of our being is something that is determined by the circumstances of your life, right? Like that. Yeah. Okay. So.
And then the other question I had is I'm still sort of fascinated by the idea of like the completion of a karma when you bring a karma to fruition is considered a cessation, which seems to me as kind of a very like.
Wait a minute, lost cessation.
Well, didn't you say that when you complete a karmic act, that's considered a cessation?
Oh right. Okay. Yes. Okay, we're going back to that. Yes. Right. Okay.
And then so that's a way of describing something in terms of a kind of absence almost to me. At least the terminology is a kind of an absence. But then even when Rinpoche himself was describing then things like projecting karma, producing karma, those are still very positive elements and entities. So I'm just wondering if there's a way to reconcile those two, like the fact that there's one that's a cessation that seems like an absence or a negative, and then the fact that you still have this positive quality of.
Really 좋아. 미행이라는 데가 있는 이만큼 얘기해라. 그치? rangi namingi trebu namingi chai matrikta. Geval tumen chapter dorl. Geval tumen chai. 네, 소소 비르 이니 타데 말에 이네 가르사 이를 여제야 소리.
상대를
거사 타데요 말때 타데. 이 거롭지 수요래 아니 프랑스는 뭐지 디카텔라 소소기 유기 남줄 굉장히 뭐지 파마네 저기요 그래서 파마기 열대다 부장이 찬네 소소기 유기 그런 게 라바 제기 비즈니스에 라바 제기 이게 비즈니스에 이 라바 itu berada. Nami Indonesia dalam ane cerita ane kurang kerja terkhusus di kurang di yang ni sebenarnya zewa dan zewa cari you're asking like what other factors besides your parents would influence the nature of your appearance?
Just the nature of appearance. Sorry, that's too strong.
The meaning of life.
Right, yeah, exactly.
What?
If there's any other influence besides your father that might say what our being.
Their destiny. Well, however our life unfolds. This is your that letter then naming loop chatiga. Hamal then kain was to the Gyumed chatiga. That's also the loosen and the young Pran Namgur condition of the member cancer and negas Shengway the others. Lutella, maybe Lutan, you could lose the Shemet trust. Shire your best, maybe your best.
Today, I'm not going to need to chat. You will chat. Only chat. I need Nami Chati, I'm going to read my duty to somebody, my young to somebody. Nami Chati, young to Jane Chati, there. Nami Chati, on the meet where I'm ever chipping Nami, we wanted Nami Chati, we wanted back. Even on the young to be a cool regulation for it. That's what I do very. And today, how many could I let in it? Dead, she want to sit and be ever. Yes, we are. Now, me very cool. Yes,
Oh, that's
Mama, the very in a sheet. No, very party. Teaching to teaching. Raji couldn't do it. So he had.
oh,
She did that. Love like my time. Chick in my ship to that. That was in a sheet and regional sheet. That is Nami will have a theater. She marked the signal here. So tell her you are a chief. But you think Nami will be today.
I think right, yeah, she did that number, yeah. Leg got you. A leg in a Kessa leg in Harsa. Lelam Kran Tutuka Ane Lugina Lugin number reject that let the Kasayon to talk about Lugin number repeat that narrative. The Kishi Niva della number Richuma Yibe Chasoti Yoga and pick up della Ane Karsa led the Shipamato Yomares. For Shipa, good sort of that Kingorina, for Shipa sort of Shipping more to your and Shipa more for chips to Sumbare これ出荷制では、出荷制では、目はそれで、目はでは、こう、検知にぬばた、そっちにぬば、レッスンでは、出荷は検知にぬばてチェックくれ。
出荷制で目はする次にね、豆塩でやれば、豆塩で運勢にしばらく、豆塩でよし。豆塩में豆बाहर से तो कुछ नहीं
豆बाहर
豆सीट मेरे豆बाहर से देखो तो豆सीट यार
अरे
शिया यार बनी शिवा से यार मशीन में पूरी शिवा में तेरे अच्छी
मार so the witch's answer was to kind of describe those two elements of our being, physically in particular. These are distinctions that appear in the Abhidharma and, the discussions that there's a relevancy to making a distinction between the aspect of our body that is represents our coarse physical form, and it's associated with, as you indicated, source of it from your parents, and then that develops into your coarse physical body. And the body, the element of your physical being that is a karmic maturation, is distinct from that, but not separate from that. So that was kind of the point that was being made. So there's, I don't know, I can't remember the exact, I'm not sure literally how to translate that. I mean, I think sort of it's developmental, I'm not sure what else to say, is the rough physical body. And the other form of the body is by the aspect of our physical being that is a karmic ripening. So the element that represents those separate aspects of our physical being can be understood such that the developmental aspect of our body corresponds to our rough physical body. That's something that is discarded when we die, for instance, our physical corpse, and it's something that can be incinerated when you what do they call it? Cremation. It can be cremated. But the maturation body is not, it's different. So that's associated with a more subtle aspect of our being, and in particular, it's identified with our faculties. And our faculties, they have the specific faculties associated with a particular birth. They have some finite quality in that they are relate to that particular form of existence, and they have the form source. The sense faculties, physical, of a human being only persist for as long as you are a human being, but that quality of being part of your physical being will continue, that faculty element of your being. So it can also, have some sort of finite quality, that it can come to an end, it can reach the point where it no longer functions. Now, that was the first part. Second part was say it should make us. So, about this thing that we said, we use the word cessation, and I think Paul kind of said, well, that's really people associate cessation with like the truth of cessation, so that's probably not the ideal word. So we were talking about it, and I think disintegration or the destruction of something that existed and then underwent disintegration or destruction, right? But that quality of having undergone disintegration or gone to a state of disintegration or destruction is not a form of non-existence. Right? The argument, which is sort of just threw this back at you to consider, if the disintegration or destruction were non-existent, then the lamp would never go on. Right? So the disintegration of the lamp is a condition that comes about because the fuel has been exhausted. And so therefore we say the lamp has been extinguished or gone out, right? Gone to a state of I won't say non-existent, but saying that word for its disappearance, right? But if that were not an entity that existed, not condition that came into being, then the thing would not cease. That was one thing. So another thing that he said was, if there were not such a okay, leave it alone. Time is gone.